The letter to the Colossians is one of Paul's so-called prison letters, the others being Ephesians, Philippians and Philemon. There are three main candidates for where Paul was imprisoned when he wrote the letter: Ephesus, Caesarea or Rome, the more likely being Ephesus or Rome. We considered the same question when we read Philemon, and those who argue for Ephesus point out that it was a lot closer to Colossae than Rome. Colossae being about 100 miles or so east of Ephesus, and so it was much easier for Onesimus to get to Paul. Paul mentions that in 4 chapter 9, Onesimus, who is from Colossae, is coming to visit him, and in Philippians that he will send Epaphroditus to Colossae. And in both Philemon and Philippians, Paul expresses the hope that he will come to them soon. But it is of course possible that, although it would take a lot longer, these journeys could still take place between Colossae and Rome. And it is surprising that neither any of Paul's letters nor Acts refer to an Ephesian imprisonment. Moreover, in his letter to the Philippians, Paul mentions the presence of the imperial guard, but there is no evidence that these were based in senatorial provinces, which is what Asia Minor was classed as. And we do know that Paul was imprisoned in Rome at least once, and it is plausible that that is where these letters were written. If it were Ephesus, then Paul may have written this letter in the early to mid-50s, but if Rome, perhaps 60 to 61. Some scholars think that some of Paul's statements reflect a later point in the development of his thought, and so prefer the later date where Paul was certainly in Rome. Fortunately for us, it does not affect how we read the letter. The church in Colossae was not founded by Paul, but by a missionary he sent, Epaphras, who was a native of the city. This was an effective strategy because a native wouldn't need time to explore the city or find somewhere to stay or work, and would have an initial audience in his or her family and friends. Colossae did have a Jewish population, but its composition would have been Gentile in the majority and from a pagan background. It is thought that these influences, especially as they came into contact with Jewish belief, gave rise to either too much focus on or a misunderstanding of spiritual powers and festivals. Thus, Paul warns them later in the letter to be wary of such things and offers some adjustments to their theology. Despite this, his letter does not seem to be sent in a crisis, and he is not angry with them as he was with the Galatians. In fact, as chapter 1 shows, he has much to praise them for, with their faithfulness, confidence and displays of love. There are two particularly significant things which Colossians gives us. The first is the so-called Christological hymn in chapter 1, which we will look at in a moment. And the second is what is known as the Christus Victor view of the atonement, which comes from 2:15. This emphasises the glorious defeat of evil powers on the cross, in a way similar to John's description of the crucifixion as Jesus' glorification. Returning to chapter 1, from verses 15 to 20, there is a section which describes Jesus in the most exalted terms possible. It is often referred to as a hymn, although it is not written in poetry. It may have been something the Colossians used, as we saw Paul quoting slogans back to the Corinthians. Or perhaps Paul is just saying it himself, expounding the glorious nature of Christ like this to the Colossians because of what he wants to say in verses 21 to 23. Either way, the truths of what he says about Jesus are incredible. In verses 15 to 17, we can see a number of concepts which should be familiar to us, having just read Proverbs. There we saw that wisdom was personified as a woman who existed before creation and by whom God created everything. After Jesus, this Old Testament idea became a template for Christians to understand and express Jesus' divine nature. God is separated from all creation because he exists before it and independently of it. He needs nothing to exist, but everything that does exist, which he made, depends on him completely. The first Christians understood that Jesus himself fulfills that role. In a way similar to the way he mediates between us and God in reconciliation, so he is involved in creation. John's Gospel also expresses this very clearly in his prologue, and the beginning of Hebrews does as well. Putting Jesus at the very centre of creation, both as the way things were created, but also as the sustainer of all things, underlines Jesus' identity with God in the clearest possible terms for a Jewish mind. And for any pagans or ex-pagans who wondered about other gods or mini-gods or anything, Paul makes explicit too that these are subordinate to Jesus. Again, we saw the same thing in Hebrews chapter 1, though with the angels. In verse 18, Paul repeats the identification that Jesus is the firstborn, not now of all creation, but of the new creation, that is, the first one of the resurrection age which will dawn in the future. As such, he is the head of the church, the body. This is because, as he goes on in verses 19 to 20, all the fullness of God dwells in Jesus, and that as God created all things through Jesus, so now he reconciles all things through Jesus, and that by his blood on the cross. In these last two verses, Paul brings down from the eternal cosmos the unfathomable and invisible deity into Jesus' earthly body, and the unfathomable and decisive reconciliation onto a cross, as real as it stood on the earth 2,000 years ago, as it was effective in the heavenly realms. Jesus, the firstborn, the very image of God, has made peace for us through his blood on the cross.